This is the second great book that has rushed onto the world in the last 4 or 5 years. It's Christopher Hitchens' God is Not Great. Because this God that Jesus speaks of, this God that Jesus claims to be, lets unspeakable horrors exist. We know about the girl recently in California for, 18 years was kept in a shed and birthed 2 children who grew up in a shed. I can go on and on. It takes no creativity to list all the horrors that we're consistently exposed to in the media today. And God is sovereign over that? You've got to be kidding me. If that God is God, then he's my devil, as been famously said.
Right.
And so Hitchens is there to say not only is he immoral, he is irresponsible and asleep.
Yes. I would respond to this by saying we need to draw some distinctions here concerning what philosophers have called the problem of evil or the problem of pain and suffering. I think there's a distinction, Todd, between this problem as an intellectual problem and this problem as an emotional problem. And I think emotionally there's certainly no doubt that the evil and pain and suffering in the world occasion great doubts that God exists. But I have to say that when I consider the problem philosophically as a purely intellectual problem, I think it's extraordinarily difficult for the atheist to mount a convincing argument that the evil and suffering in the world renders God's existence either impossible or improbable.
Okay. Lay that on us.
There are different versions of the intellectual problem of evil. One is the logical version, and basically what it says is that God and evil are logically incompatible with each other. They're like the immovable object and the irresistible force. They can't both exist. If one exists, the other doesn't exist. It can't exist. And since evil obviously exists, it follows that God cannot exist. Now, the problem with this argument is that there's no contradiction between saying God is all-powerful and all-loving and evil exists. There's no explicit contradiction there. So if the atheist is saying these are implicitly contradictory, he must be making some hidden assumptions that would bring out this contradiction and make it explicit. So the question is, well, what are those hidden assumptions that the atheist is making? And it seems to me that there are two. He's assuming that if God is all-powerful, then he can create any world that he wants. And secondly, he's assuming that if God is all good, that he would prefer to create a world without evil or without suffering. And both of these hidden assumptions need to be necessarily true in order to show a contradiction between God's existence and the evil in the world. And the problem is that neither of those assumptions appears to be necessarily true. For example, does God's being all-powerful mean that he can create just any world that he wants? Well, not if he chooses to give creatures free will. It is logically impossible to make someone do something freely. That is as logically impossible as making an unmarried bachelor or a square circle. So there may well be worlds that are impossible for God to create, because in them the creatures would freely perpetrate evil and harm upon each other. And if God wants a world to have significant moral agents in them who achieve moral goodness, he may have to put up with a good deal of moral evil as well. So that first assumption is just not necessarily true. And similarly, the second assumption, if God is...
Let me interject with that. So what you're basically saying is that because God's going to create a perfect and good creation, that perfect and good creation must have in it creatures that have the ability to do things that are good, which include love. And in order to be able to love, you got to have the ability to choose to not love.
That's exactly right. In order for there to be moral goodness in a world, you've got to have more than robots or puppets. You've got to have free agents. And once you do that, then things can get out of control, in the sense that these agents can perpetrate evil and harm upon one another, which God could prevent only by removing their freedom of the will, in which case he removes moral goodness as well.
Which makes it a moral world, which is not a perfect world.
Right. It would be a world without any sort of moral goodness. So it's simply not true that God's being all-powerful means that he can just create any old world that he desires, as the atheist seems to assume. And the second assumption I don't think is necessarily true either. That is that if God is all good, then he prefers a world without evil and suffering. We all know cases in which we permit evil and suffering to occur for some greater good that can be brought about. C.S. Lewis once remarked, I think very aptly, what do people mean, I'm not afraid of God because I know that he is good? Have they never even been to the dentist? And of course, Lewis wrote that before Novocaine was used when they drilled on your teeth. We know cases where we allow pain and suffering to occur for some sort of greater good. Every parent, I think, knows that fact. So that second assumption just isn't true either. And therefore, the atheist has failed to show any sort of logical inconsistency between God and the existence of evil. In fact, we can actually show that these are consistent by adding a third proposition, which I think is on the screen. Namely, God could not have created a world which had as much good as the actual world, but with less evil, and God has morally sufficient reasons for permitting the evil that exists. As long as that's even possible, it proves that God and evil are logically consistent. And therefore, I'm very happy to be able to tell folks this morning that this logical version of the problem of evil is widely, almost unanimously regarded today as resolved. Even by atheist philosophers, they don't press this problem anymore because they've recognized that it's just impossible for the atheist to prove it's impossible for God and evil to coexist, and it's very easy for the theist to offer an explanation or an account of how they might be coexistent.
In fact, when I was with you in downtown Dallas, when you discussed this with Christopher Hitchens, and while Hitchens was winsome and hilarious and gave lots of anecdotal stories, at the end of the day, he could not argue against the existence of God and even acknowledged what about the Christian solution to evil.
Yes, that was one thing that was surprising about Hitchens, wasn't it? Was that he had the honesty to admit that, yes, at the end of the day, this argument really doesn't go through. What it has, again, is simply emotional force.
Yes.
But you see, as a philosopher, I'm called upon not to say how I feel about something, but what I think about it. And when you think about it...
That's what men get in trouble with their wives right
well,
there.
Granted, but
you realize
we're not
that.
dealing
Can I
with
tell my
wives.
wife I'm a philosopher? I'm not supposed to feel. Let me explain to you what you don't understand. I've tried that. That doesn't work well.
My wife has learned to argue logically with me.
Oh, goodness. All right. So, Hitchens, I think he said that, look, the Christian argument for evil is cogent, it's coherent, if it was true. And then I think I love the way you summarized that debate. It wasn't a debate because he didn't come prepared. Do you remember what you said to him at the end of that?
Well, I think I do. What do you remember?
I think what you did is you basically said, Christopher, and I think you were going to be together with him shortly after that.
Right. We had a debate scheduled at Biola University just 2 weeks after this panel discussion in Dallas.
Right. And so you said to him,
I said, after summarizing the arguments and his failure to refute them, he was seated to my left, and I turned to him and I said, so I hope, Mr. Hitchens, that when we meet in 2 weeks at Biola University, you have done substantially more study on these arguments so that you can discuss them in a more significant way.
Yeah, you basically undressed him. You basically said, you just acknowledge that everything I've said is true. You're not, what you have is no really philosophical or intellectual support, and I couldn't even debate you.
And the funny thing is, he didn't do that homework.
No, of course.
He showed up unprepared at Biola as well.
Because what Bill Maher does, what Christopher has done is, you're right, they appeal to the emotion.
Yeah.
They use humor to distract.
Ridicule is one of their most important weapons. Satire and ridicule. And that will persuade people in a way that often argument will not.
Right.
Because people, unfortunately, so often don't think logically. They don't know how to think logically. That's why I love that song that Sasha sung about what if you go deeper than your simple-minded friends and begin to poke holes in the logic. Yeah. You suddenly discover that all of this atheist rhetoric is just that. It's mere rhetoric and emotional appeals.
Yeah. Which, boy, it sure helps me sleep well until I'm honest. I mean, it allows me in the public square, but laying in bed at night, I think the simple-mindedness pierces our hearts, and that's God reaching out, drawing you back, saying, hey, consider me, away from the humor and away from the ridicule.